So moving on from navbars, forms and tables are two things that with plain HTML, it can take a lot of effort to make them look good. If we have a look at a basic form, I'm just going to get rid of all my navbar code. I might have something like email and then an input. I'm going to do very minimal code here, and then a submit button. Something like that, and I'm just going to take out Bootstrap for the moment. It doesn't look great. It does the job and the user knows what to do, hopefully, but it looks pretty 90s. Similarly with tables, if we put in a very quick table, then, in fact, I'll be very lazy and just put loads of robs in this time. It gets the alignment right, but other than that, it doesn't look like something you'd want to put on your web page. There are also two elements that are pretty difficult to make look nice responsively, that is, on a number of different screen sizes, from your huge desktop to your small user's phone. Fortunately though, Bootstrap has us covered. So let's see how we use Bootstrap to make nice, pretty forms and tables. So we'll go back over to the Bootstrap website. And under components here, I'm going to click on forms. And let's scroll down pretty quickly to get something that looks like a form. And there we go. You can see it looks a lot nicer than your standard form. And of course, because this is Bootstrap, it's responsive as well. So it will change behavior and look nice on a range of different screen sizes. So as before, rather than writing all the code out from scratch, I'm going to copy the Bootstrap code and we'll have a look through once we've got it up and running on our site, see how it works. So there we go. There's our lovely form. We should probably put it in a container. Because we don't want it spread out right to the end of the screen like that. There we go. So then you get those nice borders and that responsive effect as well. So you can see the spacing's really nice. We've got a good bit of padding in the inputs there, and all the different elements are styled nicely. And we've got those nice pretty buttons that we saw earlier as well at the bottom. So let's have a look and see how we code it, because it is slightly different. Obviously this is still HTML, so we still have the form element at the beginning. We then have a field set, which is an element that we haven't seen before, but essentially it's a way of grouping together a number of form elements. Quite often it's only one, but you can put more than one in there if you want. You can see here most of the elements are inside a field set. So we've got our input there, and then our password input, and then our select, etc. So this has a class of form group, which gives it those styles. And then Bootstrap uses labels, which we have seen before, but we haven't used a great deal. They are a standard HTML element, and the advantage is that the label is then linked to the input itself. So you can style it relatively to that input. And you can see it's linked via the ID there. So we've got our label, then we've got our input. We're used to seeing the type and ID and placeholder, but we've got a class of form control. A form control is just a way of referring to any form element. So input there as well. Select would be a form control, text area, etc. So that's again what gives it the stylings. And worth noting as well, we've got a type of email here, which I don't think we've seen before. It's one of the HTML5 types, and it's very well supported by Bootstrap. So if you try and submit a form with an invalid email address, automatically a warning if the email address is not correct. And that's something that we don't need to program in at all, but it's something that Bootstrap does for us. which, as is the aim here, makes our life a lot easier. Then we've got some text with an element of small, which again we haven't seen before, but essentially it's just a paragraph tag, but with small text. And this has got the text muted class that we saw in the previous video, which makes it slightly faded as well. Okay, so that's our email address. We then close the filled set element and open up a new one for our password. And from here on out, everything's more or less the same. So the two classes that are critical here are the form group class and the form control class. So they give all the styles and the layouts. And the rest just follow a very similar structure, and we're used to seeing radio inputs, text areas, etc. All right, so a quick bit of practice then to get this into your head. So remember those two special classes that we needed. Can you create a simple form that asks for an email address and a password and has a submit button at the bottom? Go for it. Okay, hope you managed it. This is what I would do. I'll start with my container div. I didn't specifically say that you needed a container div, so don't worry if you didn't put one in. But with Bootstrap, unless you want something to specifically go right to the edge of the screen, then I'd recommend putting in a container div every time. Then we create our form. No special classes there. Tricky getting my tabs to line up, that'll do. Then we create a field set with a class of form group. So that's important class number 1. And then I'm going to create a label for my email address. I'll just call it email address. And I need to specify that this is for, and it's for the input that I'm just about to create, which I'll have an ID of email. And then we'll create an input with an ID of email. It's going to have a type of email as well. And it needs to have a class. And it needs to have a class of form control. There we go. I'm not going to do a placeholder or anything here. We'll keep it as simple as possible. Let's have a look. There we go. So we're looking good already. Then for our password, we'll create another field set with another class of form group. And then, just as before, label for, and this is going to have an ID of password. And we'll have an input with a type of password and an ID of password, and of course a class of form control. Great. And finally, we'll have another field set with a class of form group. And we'll have a button with a type of submit and a class of button, and we want a blue one, so button dash primary, and I'll just have the text of submit. All right, let's take a look. There we go. Fantastic. So I hope you managed to produce something similar. It is a good idea when you're learning these things to type it out for yourself at least once, so you've got it fairly clear in your head what the classes are and how it all fits together. Once you've done that though, there's no shame in going back to the Bootstrap site and copying and pasting direct from there. Okay, just before we move on to tables, let's have a little look at some of the alternative layouts and features of Bootstrap forms. So the standard layout is what we've seen here, the label above the input. But quite often you might want the label to the left of the input. And you can do that very simply just by adding the class form-inline to the form itself. So let's have a look and see how that changes things. So all we're doing is adding a single class of form inline. And now the form looks like that. Essentially, it's all in a single line. So that's great for, say, a small login form or maybe a search form at the top of your website. But quite often, you won't want the whole thing to be in a line, but you will want the labels just to be to the left of the inputs themselves. So if we just scroll down a little, there's an option to do that. There we go. So this is my favorite layout because it's using the screen space well for a wide screen. But then if we go narrow enough, then it uses the vertical layout again. So very quick challenge again then. Can you apply this layout to the form that we've got here? Go for it. Hint, there's the HTML you're going to need. All right, hope you managed to do that. Notice we're going to remove the inline form class from form. And the way this whole thing works is we're putting columns around our labels and inputs. So just like we saw in the grid section previously, in the grids video previously, we've got a 2-column class on the label and then a 10-column class on the div which contains the input. So I'm going to add a row class to my field set. I'm going to experiment a little bit here. It should work fine with field set even though they're using div here. Field set is essentially a div anyway. It just makes semantically clear that we're working with form fields rather than just generic content. So I'm going to add a class to my label of COL for column small because we want this to switch into the stacked layout when we hit the phone screen size, which is SM, and then we'll give that one 2 columns. And then we want a div with a class of, again, columns, small, and then 10 columns, this one. There we go. So let's just have a quick look. Looks very good. So if we expand that, yep, that looks nice. And then when we get to a narrow enough point, it reverts to how it was before. Great. So very quickly, let's apply that to password as well. So I'm just going to copy and paste to keep things speedy. So we've got that class for the label. We're going to add a row class to the field set. And then we're going to add our div to surround the password input. Excellent. So with a big screen, it's going to look great like that. With a smaller screen, it compresses it a little, and then a very small screen, it goes stacked. Great. So that's more or less all I'm going to show you with forms. Feel free to have a look at the more layout options here. They're all pretty useful. And if you're making complex forms especially, then you'll be very grateful for things like inline checkboxes or radio buttons, removing labels, adding disabled states to inputs, read-only inputs, and one more I'll just show you which is quite nice is adding some info to the end of an input. Like here, I really like this layout. And you do that with the class input group add-on. If you put that before the input, then it will add some content before the actual interactive part of the input, and then you can add some at the end as well. So that's Bootstrap Forms. They're pretty, they're functional, and they're easy to use. Let's have a look now at Bootstrap Tables, which are all of that and more. So for tables, we'll go back to Bootstrap and Content, and then Tables. Remember, the layout of your Bootstrap site may be slightly different to mine, but you should be able to find tables quite easily. So we'll go through these a little bit quicker than we did the forms because you've got the idea now. But mostly you can see that these are a lot prettier than normal tables. So let's copy the code. And we'll see that there's not a great deal to change there. So I'll put it just above the form so we can have both there at once. And then let's have a look. There it is. So there's our nice pretty table. How are we doing that? It's actually very simple. We've got a table with a class of table. Pretty much all the work. If we remove that class, then the table just reverts back to a normal table, albeit with a prettier font than usual. You can see we've also got a scope attribute here. This is not actually a Bootstrap thing. It's a general HTML way of saying that this th, which remember is short for table header, is the header for this row. So you could also have a th with a scope of col for column, for example. But that is kind of considered the default. So essentially this doesn't make any difference at all. If we get rid of it, then everything will still look exactly the same. It just makes it clear that we're using th, but it's not a column header, it's a row header. The rest of the syntax though is exactly the same as the tables that we've looked at before. So let's jump straight to seeing what fancy things we can do with tables and Bootstrap. So we can make a nice inverse table, simply enough, by using the table inverse class. Let's have a little look. Notice that pattern again of having an initial class and then other classes which customize that first class type. There we go. So there's our inverse table. We can apply classes to the table head. Again, so thead inverse and thead default to show different backgrounds there. And we can apply those to table rows as well. One of my favorites is the table striped. So let's have a look at that one. There we go. So that just makes a long table especially a lot more readable than if every row is the same color. And then there are various other ones, so you can make it completely bordered, hoverable, like that, all with a single class. All of these things will be a lot of work to code if you were doing it separate from Twitter. Then they've got a small table, and we can apply our usual colorings to the rows and the cells as well, using active, success, info, warning, danger, etc. And of course, we can make our tables responsive as well. Alright, so now that we've fixed two of the very commonly used HTML elements, tables and forms, we're going to have a run through some of the coolest and most useful Bootstrap components in the next video.